On today's episode of Authentic, we're going to be talking about the devil, and we'll see if we can't separate fact from fiction. So buckle up and get ready for a bit of a strange ride through history. Welcome to a very special episode of Authentic, where I'm going to quite literally speak of the devil. Or, to be more precise, I'm going to talk about how we got our current understanding of who or what the devil is in Western Christianity. And that's important because when I mention the devil, most people get this mental image of a red guy with horns and a pitchfork and a tail. He's kind of half man and half goat, and that's the way that pop culture almost always portrays him. The only problem with that portrayal is that there's nothing even close to that description to be found in the Bible, because it's really a better fit for pagan mythology. The description of Lucifer that you find in the Bible is anything but grotesque. In fact, the Bible suggests that the devil is really quite attractive. I mean, just listen to this passage from the book of Ezekiel, where God is talking to the king of Tyre. But it becomes obvious after a few sentences that he's actually speaking to the devil by appealing to the king's reputation. Here's what it says. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God. Now, here's where it becomes obvious that he's actually speaking to the devil. It says, You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. And of course, the literal king of Tyre was never anywhere near the Garden of Eden, so this is actually talking to somebody else. It continues, Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz and diamond, beryl, onyx and jasper, sapphire, turquoise and emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. Now, remember, in the Old Testament sanctuary, the covering cherubs were the angels on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was a symbolic representation of God's throne in heaven. So what this is actually telling us is that Lucifer used to have one of the most exalted positions in God's government right next to the eternal throne of God. It says, I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. Now, in the Bible, that's where God's throne is located. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. Now, here's what I want you to notice. There are no horns, no tail, no red skin. The Bible describes a fallen angel, and in his second letter to the Corinthian church, the Apostle Paul suggests that the devil appears as an angel of light. So you've got to wonder, where in the world did we get the pop art devil that looks like a red version of the Greek god Pan? Well, it's a pretty long story, but I think it's worth exploring, because after 2,000 years of Christianity, we've got a lot of non-biblical artifacts that have made their way into our belief system. And while most of them are perfectly harmless, there are some cultural artifacts that have skewed the way that people actually think about the Christian faith. When the Christian church started taking over Western Europe in the wake of Constantine's conversion, and then especially after the conversion of the Frankish king Clovis, Christian bishops found themselves continually running up against the pagan beliefs of the Celts and the Germanic tribes. And these were pagans who had no desire to convert to Christianity at all. And just like the Greeks, the Romans, and the Egyptians, the pagans of Europe had a rather large stable of gods. And that pantheon was such a fundamental part of their culture that you still find remnants of it in our culture today. For example, some of the days of the week are named for Roman gods, like Saturday, which is named for Saturn. But some of the other days are named for Teutonic or Germanic gods, like Wednesday, which is literally Woden's Dag or Woden's Day. And Thursday is Thorsdag, and so on. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that, and I sincerely doubt that anybody thinks I'm worshiping Thor just because I use the Germanic name for the 5th day of the week. Now, in some places, Christian missionaries openly challenged these pagan gods, like the famous missionary Boniface, the man who tried to convert my ancestors, the Frisians, who were tree-worshipping pagans through and through. So what Boniface did was cut down their sacred oak tree, which really upset a lot of people. And eventually, they beheaded the missionary. But in other places, the church looked for ways to compromise, to incorporate some of the local culture into the church in order to make Christianity seem more attractive. So, for example, you'll notice that in some parts of the Christian world, we still have patron saints who are dedicated to the various activities of daily life. You have St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, and St. Joseph, the patron saint of dying people. And that really harkens back to the days when our pagan ancestors had various gods dedicated to different activities. They had Venus, the goddess of love, and Mars, the god of war, and Mercury, the messenger god, and so on. So what the church really did was find a Christianized substitute that would allow the pagans to keep some of their customs. You'll notice that the same thing happened with a lot of pagan holidays. The 31st of October was known to the Celts as Samhain, the day when they believed that the veil between the living and the dead became really, really thin. So they built massive bonfires and put candles inside of carved out turnips in order to keep the spirits of the dead at bay. It was such a prominent part of Celtic culture that the church decided they couldn't just get rid of it. So they rebranded it as All Hallows Eve, or Halloween, which was a special festival the night before All Saints' Day on the 1st of November. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Over the course of time, a lot of the pagan gods and festivals were just Christianized, rebranded. But there was one major deity among the European pagans that the church really could not adopt. And it posed a major problem because it was such a deeply entrenched part of pagan culture. He was known as the Horned God, and he was a very ancient figure for a lot of ancient pagan traditions, not just in Western Europe. He was the god of nature and was probably derived from a time before the pagans of the Western world had adopted agriculture and the domestication of animals. Before that time, they were hunters. And this horned god was the god of hunting, a character who held the keys to the darkest parts of the forest. Now, among some of the Celtic tribes, this horned god was known as Cernunnos, a name that contains the root word for horn. The Latin word for horn is cornu, and Cernunnos was the Celtic cognate of that Latin word. Most of you know what a cornucopia is. It's a horn of plenty. And you'll see that Cernunnos starts the same way, with the Latin word for horn. So when we come across some of the ancient depictions for this horned god, he's usually shown sitting in a lotus position, kind of like the Buddha. And he's got deer antlers on his head. In one hand, he's often holding a torque, which is a stiff braided ring of metal that you wore around the neck. And in his other hand, he holds a serpent. He's usually depicted with all kinds of wild game all around him because he was the patron god of hunting. But he was also the god of the underworld, the one who welcomed you to the afterlife. Among some tribes, he was also considered the god of fertility, so he was a really practical god, covering all the major concerns that a tribe of hunter-gatherers might have. He's the solution for hunger because he gives you game. He's the solution for the propagation of the species because he's in charge of fertility. And he's the solution to death because he escorts you into the afterlife. So this was a really major god. Now, in most cultures, Cernunnos was at the very apex of the pantheon, and he's probably the oldest pagan deity in the world. And what the Christian church discovered was that a lot of their would-be converts were not willing to abandon this god. So what did the church do? I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
At the beginning of the year, in the month of January, the priests of the horned god would often dress up in animal skins and put on a set of horns that they could lead their people in ecstatic dances and other pagan rituals. And they would offer sacrifices to this major god, Cernunnos. Now, this took place all over Europe, and it kept on taking place long after the Catholic Church showed up. In fact, we have records of people still dabbling in the cult of the horned god as recently as the 1800s, believe it or not. Now, in the beginning, when the church was new to Europe and relatively weak, it was more inclined to put up with pagan rituals. But then as time moved along and the church became more and more powerful, it felt less inclined to be tolerant. So what they did with this horned god was to compare him to the devil, the enemy of Christ. Suddenly, pictures of Lucifer started to look like these pagan priests wearing their horns and animal skins. European pagans were now said to be devil worshippers, which might be the reason that people still confuse European paganism with Satanism, and they're not the same thing. In fact, today's practitioners of Wicca will tell you that Satan is a Christian character who doesn't play any part in their belief system. Now, of course, for Christians, every belief system outside of the Bible is said to be at least inspired by the devil, but the pagans of Europe did not recognize an individual named Lucifer or Satan. Now, as a point of clarification, when the church continued to become more powerful and they started to persecute pagans, some of those pagans gladly labeled Cernunnos as Satan in order to let the bishops know that they were indeed enemies of their church. They said, look, if that's what these people hate, then that's who we are. And to really push back, they started taking aspects of the Catholic Mass and mocking it during their own rituals in order to clap back against these aggressive missionaries. So I guess over time, some of these pagan cults really did start to look like devil worship. But it was the Christian church that made the first move by quite literally demonizing this horned god. And then starting in the 13th century or so, Satan suddenly began to appear in Christian artwork looking the way that we think about him today. Half man, half animal, and horns. But that's not an image that you'll find in the pages of the Bible. It just doesn't exist. So, to make a long story short, when the church couldn't find any way to redeem this pagan deity or rebrand him as some kind of Christian character, they made him into Satan in order to get rid of him. And if you look through the records of the Catholic bishops, you'll find some of them wringing their hands in anguish over this problem, like this account from the 7th century from the British Archbishop Theodore. He wrote, "If anyone at the calends of January goes about as a stag or a bull, that is, making himself into a wild animal and dressing in the skin of a herd animal and putting on the heads of beasts, those who in such wise transform themselves into the appearance of a wild animal, penance for 3 years, because this is devilish." So in the beginning, Satan actually appeared with deer antlers, not the goat horns that we see today. And over time, we added the goat horns so that he looked more and more like the Greek god Pan, who was another pagan god of the wilderness. Which brings me to another rather notorious depiction of the devil that modern occultists use, which is Baphomet. Chances are you might be familiar with this one because some modern occult groups have provoked an awful lot of animosity by insisting that they want to put a statue of children adoring Baphomet on government property. And they want that as a way of pushing back against Christians who want the Ten Commandments or nativity scenes to be on display at the government courthouse. But again, you'll notice that Baphomet is goat-like. He's a horned god with a goat's head and a man's body, and it comes with a pentagram drawn on his chest, which comes from the ancient mystery religions of the very distant past. And from what I can tell, the first time this figure showed up in Western culture was shortly after the Crusades started. Some people actually think that Baphomet is a corruption of the name Muhammad, because Christian soldiers were trying to demonize the Muslims, which means that they were kind of doing the same thing the church did with the pagans. They were casting their enemies in the role of the devil in order to make them seem really, really evil. Now, what's kind of interesting is the way that the Knights Templar eventually got smeared with a rumor about this horn god Baphomet. They were the order of knights charged with protecting the Holy Land from Muslims, or more specifically, the city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. When the order eventually fell out of favor with the official church, people started spreading a rumor that these Templars had been worshiping the horned god. So we still have all kinds of fantastic stories about Templars in circulation to this day. And they even still show up in modern conspiracy theories. The Baphomet that you see today, like the one they wanted to put on government property in the state of Oklahoma, well, it's a modernization of a much older version of the same thing. The finishing touches were added by a famous occultist named Eliphas Levi, who published a famous book on occult practices back in 1897. So, to recap, during the medieval period, we picked up all kinds of pagan leftovers from the cultures we were trying to bring into the Christian church, because we were trying to grease the conversion process. And while some of these customs, like, kissing under the mistletoe, were harmless, there were other cultural artifacts that began to distort our understanding of Christianity itself, like the way we think about Lucifer. In the Bible, Lucifer is a covering cherub, and he's the only angel who ever gets commended for beauty. We saw that in the famous passage from Ezekiel chapter 28. But then in Isaiah chapter 14, we find a description of the very moment that this covering cherub fell from grace. Here's what it says, starting in verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. What we have in the Bible is a highly exalted angel who let his power and position go to his head. He began to crave a higher status than the one God had given him, right up to the point where he started to think he actually belonged on God's throne. And so for that reason, he had to be removed from the presence of God before he did any more damage. Now, the damage he did do was substantial. In fact, the Bible mentions that he managed to poison the minds of 1/3 of heaven's angels, who then joined his rebellion, which you find described in Revelation 12, where it describes how the struggle between good and evil in this universe began. Here's what it says. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. What we have in the Bible is a serpentine devil, not a goat-like devil. He's the serpent in Eden, and he's the dragon of the book of Revelation. It says that he managed to deceive a large number of angels, and back in verse 4, it tells us that 1/3 of the stars in heaven joined him. Now, stars are a common symbol for angels, and what it's telling us is that 1/3 of the heavenly host turned their backs on their Creator at the beginning of this cosmic war. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
When the Bible tells us that the devil was thrown out of heaven, it doesn't say that he was sent to live in the bowels of the earth, where he shovels coal on the fires of hell for all eternity. You just won't find that anywhere in the Bible. The Bible simply says he and his angels were cast to the earth. This idea that the devil lives down there somewhere beneath our feet in some fiery cave, well, that's just another medieval hangover that has no biblical foundation whatsoever. I mean, just remember that the horned god of the Celts was also the keeper of the underworld, and the same was true for Greek pagans. Hades was their god of a shadowy realm of the dead. It was a decidedly pagan way of thinking about death, and the devil as we conceive of him today was reassigned to step into that pagan role, which kind of makes you wonder just how much of what we believe about death, hell, and the afterlife is actually found in the Bible. There was also this ancient pagan story from Europe about a creature known as the Harlequin, a word that eventually morphed into harlequin, which is a jester or a fool, as in the joker that you find in a pack of playing cards. The Harlequin was a giant monster who escorted the spirits of the dead. So Europe was permeated with these very old stories about people encountering the Harlequin in the dead of night. Now, in a lot of Germanic languages like Dutch, this same character was known simply as the Hellequin, a ghostly creature who hunted at night. It's a word that should look familiar because it's got the word hell in it, or the pagan underworld. And it's got the word kin, which means a troop or a family. So the Hellequin was a creature who led a troop of beings from the underworld. What we did was recast all these pagan characters as the devil. And Satan now became the god of the underworld, even though the Bible never says any such thing. Now, that doesn't mean the Bible doesn't talk about fire, because it does. In fact, in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus mentions a fire that is prepared for the devil and his angels. But at the same time, there's nothing anywhere in the Bible to suggest that this fire is under the ground or it's just a Christian version of the pagan Hades. Instead, the fire is said to burn on the surface of the earth. In fact, if you look at Matthew chapter 13, you'll find Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares, where he says that the fire doesn't burn until the end of the world. And then it burns up here on the surface of the earth. So this idea that the devil is living somewhere beneath our feet is really just a lot of medieval superstition, and you will not find it in the pages of the Bible. So of course now you've got to wonder, why am I spending so much time talking about this? Well, let me put it this way. Christianity has an awful lot of critics who like to poke holes in our faith. And personally, I believe that Christianity will stand up against that criticism. After all, it's still here after 2,000 years, in spite of some rather determined efforts to get rid of it. But what I quite often find is that people who mock the Christian faith are mocking caricatures and fairy tales that aren't actually found in the Bible. And the sad part is that many Christians try to defend those ideas even though they were never taught by Jesus and never taught by the disciples. These are just fairy tales and they're not biblical. Now, to be clear, the Bible does describe a devil, a fallen angel who led a rebellion against heaven and then convinced the human race to follow his example. But he doesn't have horns, he isn't part goat, and he doesn't live in a fiery cave. And at least part of the reason people mock the idea of a devil is because the Christian church has actually participated in the cartoon version of this character. And the same thing has happened with other aspects of the Christian faith. More often than people might realize, well-loved Christian teachings actually don't have a basis in Scripture. For example, most of us think of cherubs not as impressive creatures who stand next to the throne of God, but as little babies with wings that you find on Victorian Christmas cards. Not in the Bible. We talk about St. Peter letting people into heaven as if he's the guardian of the afterlife, but again, not in the Bible. It's just another rewrite of pagan mythology. And of course, there's almost no chance Jesus was actually born on the 25th of December. It's a date we borrowed from a Roman winter festival. And here's another one. It comes as a huge surprise for a lot of people when they learn that Christians actually continued to observe the Sabbath and not Sunday. And they did that for hundreds of years. And while the Bible absolutely talks about heaven as a real place, the location of God's throne, it doesn't actually say that you and I are going to live there for eternity. Instead, it says that we're going to go there for a little bit, but then Jesus, who is God in human form, takes up residence with us here on this planet. I mean, just listen to this. It's one of my favorite passages from Revelation chapter 21. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. So I guess what I'm saying is this. If you're going to discuss the Bible with people, at least you make sure you know what it actually says. Read the whole thing, because I think you might be surprised by what you find. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Okay, maybe let me ramp up by saying that one of the biggest problems modern Christians have comes from the fact that we've had 20 long centuries that involve some pretty bad thinking. A lot of people think they know what the Bible says, but there's enough water under the bridge now that we really need to go back and do our homework and make sure. Sometimes we just think the Bible teaches something. So maybe it's time to go to the basics again and have a look at what the founders of this movement actually wrote under inspiration. And when you do that, you can't just pick and choose what you're going to read or believe, or you'll end up with the same problem again. You know, to be honest, a lot of the criticism that people leave on the church's doorstep, a lot of it is perfectly justified. And sometimes when somebody says that one of our beliefs is ridiculous, they might actually be right. So it's really important to know for sure what the Bible teaches. And in order to know that, you have to read it. And as Paul told the church in Thessalonica, do not quench the Spirit. Do not despise prophecies. Test all things. Hold fast what is good. It's the same thing that he said to his young protege, Timothy, when he wrote, Be diligent to present yourself approved to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and idle babblings, for they will increase to more ungodliness. Of course, I'm under no illusion that being more accurate with the Bible is going to stop criticism or mockery, because that's been going on since day one with the Christian church. But at least let's shoot for an honest conversation and deal with the text itself instead of the fairy tales we imported from other sources during the Dark Ages. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Sean Boonstra, and you've been watching Authentic.